Okay, so we're ready to get started. So today this is the session for IoT, Internet of Things, and AV, which stands for autonomous vehicles. I'll start with a brief intro of my background. I'm Lydia Derbysheva, and then I'll introduce our amazing panelists for today. So I'm part of Next47, which is Siemens's venture capital arm. Siemens basically restarted their venture activities in 2017 in the US. So now we have a dedicated fund of $1.2 billion just to invest fully financially for financial reasons. No need to have strategic alignment with Siemens in B2B companies on a global scale. So we look at companies in areas like enterprise, deep tech, industrial tech, areas like autonomy, of course, robotics, IoT. We've done a lot of deals in those areas, but also broader industrial areas like logistics, supply chain, kind of transportation, energy, construction tech, prop tech, and others. My background is in electrical engineering. I'm originally from Bulgaria. I was working with an Endeavor company in Indonesia, actually, a few years, 5-6 years ago. And now I'm happy to be involved again as a mentor and friend of Endeavor. And wanted to introduce Barry. Barry is joining us today from Dublin, Ireland. He is the CEO and executive chairman of Cubic Telecom. So Cubic Telecom is a connectivity and orchestration platform for the automotive industry. They're currently working with some large automotive OEMs for connected car services. It's a connected car platform, for example, where you can do over-the-air updates, introduce connectivity, Wi-Fi. Barry has raised over 150 million to date and has had 3 successful exits. And very happy to have Barry here today. I'll introduce our second panelist, Greg. Greg Duval, joining us today from Buffalo, New York. Greg is part of HSBC's commercial banking group. He's MD there. He heads up the Great Lakes Banking Division, and also he's leading the transportation and logistics practice of the group. So Barry will tell us a lot about the on the ground like industry experience, and then Greg has the big picture, 10,000 feet view of the industry. So very excited to have both. I wanted to kick us off since this is a scale up summit, and we do talk about, you've heard probably the word scale up many times today. Wanted to kick us off just to kind of start talking about IoT and autonomy. And the way we define IoT is pretty broad. So IoT relates to any sensors that collect data, that harvest a lot of the data in our environment, and related especially to autonomy and transportation and to the car of the future. So my first question will be about how do you scale and how do you go to market in an IoT business in the automotive world? And Barry, would you like to kick us off?
Well, I think we fell into this business. We started off originally trying to bring distribution to connectivity, and we started with laptops and personal computing. We thought that was a way of scaling, but we then found how difficult that was, because every time a computer was sent out into the market, it was wiped, and then people would put different types of software on it. So that model didn't work for us. And then we luckily got involved with Tesla back in 2014 when they wanted to enter the China and Hong Kong market. So for us, it was really an opportunity and being in the right place at the right time for a lot of entrepreneurs, and then really focusing on what component that we could bring, and then what was the different types of challenges that we had with obviously different types of carriers and different types of radio access networks. So we really started focusing on core competencies and what we could bring to the market to try to scale. And for us, that was the Asia Pac region at the beginning.
Yep, thanks, Barry. And Greg, can you tell us a bit more about the kind of scaling IoT businesses in your perspective of how you see the industry? Like, what has been, how have these companies succeeded to get through the barriers of entry, to get through the gatekeepers?
Yeah, it's really an interesting, and it's a difficult question. It's one of the things that's kind of held back, I think, the industry. When you think about the evolution kind of autonomous vehicles, it started off as really a transformation from passive safety, your typical things of a driver, seatbelts, airbags, braking, everything, to how do we make cars safer for folks on the road. So we went toward autonomous vehicles. And great, we can make this. We know we can make sensors. We develop lidar, radar. The cars become, this electronic monster, all these different ECUs in it. But then how do you connect that to a place that's collecting all the data? I mean, there was a study done by McKinsey that talked about a single day of driving generating 30 terabytes of data. Well, what part of that data is useful? How do we take that and put it into a central area where, high program, identity, analytics, pulling it apart, saying what's useful, what's not, and how do we actually make this sensible and commercially available to folks for consumer purchase? Then it developed into, what commercial applications do we have as well, such as long haul trucking, et cetera. So, the Internet of Things, I just remember one really great example is going to the CES, and we all know that just going to CES, if you see a product, it doesn't mean that it's going to be in our lives a couple of years from now. But the floor space of CES has developed so much over the years from, all the companies that were involved, specifically with autonomous vehicles, to the number of booths there that are IoT driven and how they connect each other, as one kind of cohesive group, because that's the only way it's going to be, it's going to work for the masses. So what are the challenges? I think it's government, it's regulatory, it's cost driven. Not every consumer can even purchase, kind of level 3 ADAS today. So there are quite a few hurdles. I think, as you'll hear us discuss throughout this, there are different ways of tackling those hurdles, and corporates are thinking, not to use an old, cliche, but they're definitely thinking outside the box of how to address some of these investments.
Mm-hmm. And wanted to hear both of your perspectives more about how do you work with the big players? So IoT and the automotive space tends to be a very heavily, centralized industry where you have the massive players, which are the auto OEMs, which work with tier 1 suppliers who work with tier 2 suppliers. So it's a very structured industry, and wanted to hear both of your perspectives. How does a startup go from, a product or a service that it offers to start selling to massive customers, and how can you break into selling to these behemoths of the industry?
So I think from our perspective, when we started with an OEM, we were firstly in the right place at the right time. I think that was something that was good. But then as soon as that goes by, you have to look at, there's no common language or no standards at this moment in time. So that was a real opportunity back in 2014 that you could get in and then say, okay, we can develop a platform for you. We can really customize your solution. But it's very hard then to customize a solution for every customer that you come in as you scale, and then cost comes into it. So then you try to have to work with that OEM or work with these key industry players to start setting the standards. I think that's been the massive challenge, not just for us, but very much in autonomous driving, because the standards aren't there in that area yet. So the technology is there, and we've seen that every day. But with laws and regulatory and compliance, that's been massive challenges. So I think the opportunity is, if you look at the markets, is it horizontal or is it vertical? Okay, if you look at anything previously, it was horizontal, I said, and now you can see that starting to turn. And if we look back about in the last 5 or 10 years, if you ever said that Ford and Volkswagen would do a joint partnership for manufacturing, no one would ever believe you, and that's just happened. And if you look at Volkswagen, they've just set up the car software org, so they understand it's software that they need to move to. So this horizontal solution that was always there has now turned vertical. So this is where the opportunity is. And for us, what we've designed is a platform that can create a set of APIs or a connectivity solution, that this horizontal platform that now has gone the opposite way, or now gone vertical, local solutions can plug into us. And this is where you can drive really, really defined user experience. And this is something that I think is going to really change the market.
Mm-hmm. And Barry, to your point, how did you bring in, for example, Audi, working with such a large OEM, and you've had a lot of success with selling to OEMs? Can you tell us about what approaches did you use, or how did you bring some of these large customers on board?
Well, working with a large company or a customer is massively difficult, especially when you're based out of Ireland or a different locale for them and speaking a different language. So once we got over the language barrier, we showed our technology. But I think the big thing for us was our speed, okay, and the quality of the product. So we were able to do something really, really quickly for them, which then got them to catch up the 3-year miss that they had previously in their connected car connectivity program. So that didn't work for them. We got that traction back for them. We put them back in the market. So that gained a lot of confidence in them. with us. And then they looked at how we were designing that. And then again, we were showing, because we were using software and no hardware, and that we defined everything into the cloud, it could scale into different regions. So we took a completely different approach where people were using on-prem hardware. So we really were using the new innovative ways. And again, as soon as you start using software, you turn that into APIs, and then you start talking technical language to their IT teams. And they've now really tried to chase after Tesla and other companies to go after that EV electrical space. And they have to do that. It always has to be connected. So for us, it was really taking that horizontal thing that the car guys were at for the last 100 years as metal companies and turning it and saying, okay, let's go after software with them.
Mm-hmm. And wanted to also touch upon, like, what are the elements of success? Like, what makes an IoT company successful, and what are, for example, parts of the stack, of the IoT stack, from sensors to data to analytics and more, and maybe using AI and machine learning, where in the stack is value aggregated, and where do you see, like, where do the winners play?
Well, I was talking with Greg earlier on this, and it was very, very, if you look like 5 or 6 years ago, and again, back to that horizontal part, it was really the big players that were in there. So it was either the mobile carrier, it was the cloud platform, or it was the connectivity guys controlling the pipe. But now that software has really become a big element and people want to be connected, laws and regulatory have really come in and been a challenge for them. And we've seen that not just with the autonomous driving, but we've seen this with connectivity. So permanent roaming in the likes of Brazil is a challenge. And this is where Cubic has defined a market for itself by getting a local license called a Norte-Rosada that can supply connectivity. We've partnered with TIM, and that means that the same API and the same software platform is reused and scaled up. So I think this is where the real challenges and those boundaries have been starting to be broken down. So the big player does not see a likes of a Cubic, i.e. like an AT&T, a TIM, or a Vodafone. They don't see us as a competitor. They've now seen us as an enabler. So this gives us an opportunity. Agree, Greg?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, it's also the proliferation and the future advancement of 5G networks, the ability to be on private networks so that cars can connect easily and freely, low latency. There are a lot of advantages to 5G, so that's another key barrier to entry and things that's something that's got to continue to progress over time. But yeah, great points, Barry.
And I just software is key here. If you think about it, these were metal press companies, and they never thought of software. Everything was put a box into a car or put a component in. Right. All of a sudden, now we're talking about software. The mindset from the executive level has had to do with 360. They were in a tailspin for years. And then you had this company called Tesla that started up that really based everything on software and started doing OTA, so software updates to the vehicle, in 2012. The big guys have only doing it in the last year, 2 years. So it just shows you what software can do and the power of software.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, I mean, if you think about what the automotive industry is facing, just in terms of, you know, and this isn't a conversation to go down the path of EVs, but when you talk about emission standards in a cleaner world that we want to live in, a more socially responsible world that we're going to pass on to future generations, there's only so much money that's generated that can be used on research and development. So you have two key themes. You have the electrification of vehicles. You have autonomous driving. You can't spend all of your resources in either one area. You got to continue to develop both technologies. So how do you do that? It goes back to earlier comments that you made, Barry, about partnering. The number of partnerships has skyrocketed in the last 5 or 6 years, and you're really seeing it come downstream. It's outside the normal channels. It's no longer just the OEMs and the suppliers. It is the tech companies. I think a really good indicator of what's happening is the amount of venture capital funds that sprung up over the years and are investing. And Lydia, some of the companies that you've invested in your firm is really, it's a whole mindset shift away from what an automotive, what the purpose of automotive companies was before, and that was producing, passenger cars, light trucks, and on the commercial side, commercial trucks, class 5 through 8 vehicles, to how do we make this a more safe, efficient, and practical world? And then once you have that, it's okay, what else can we do with this? There's a lot of data coming in. It isn't, if we're going to really monetize this, where can we take, consumer preferences, biometrics? And that's a whole nother question in terms of whether people are comfortable or not. A car sitting there looking at you the whole time as you're sitting in it. driving and, reading your every little movement, your breathing, where your eyes are going, how often you're touching the stereo. So the whole mindset of the automotive industry has changed in the last, started with Tesla, but it's now kind of filtering through your more traditional OEMs. So a lot to think about, and how they spend their money and whether they're going to get the return on investment is really the struggle right now.
And then you said, sorry, Liddy, just how you said about spending money. With connectivity now, they can see in real time what's being used in the vehicle, and then see what's not being used in a vehicle, so they can make the user experience better, and then where they're putting their R&D into the next vehicle. And they never had that touch point with the end user because they went through a distribution model and then through a dealer. Now they know exactly what Lydia's, how she drove, what features she's using in the car. So connectivity and how IoT is really changing things, I think it can be really impressive.
Yeah, in real time, right?
And Greg, you mentioned earlier in your answer, you mentioned about 5G, and my question to both of you is, how would 5G, is 5G an enabler, and is it really a game changer? Is it going to take too long? On what is your view on kind of how is 5G fundamentally changing the IoT industry and automotive?
Yeah, I think that's Barry's area of expertise. So I'd look to him I'd even ask him that question if we were sitting down. I'd love to learn more about it.
So if you think about it, 5G is going to really, as they say, push things to the edge. And obviously having Edge on earlier, pardon the pun when I was chatting to him. But I think the whole key thing is getting the data and getting the insights in real time, Greg. And 3G started enabling that, first of all, with just really open the doors, unlock the doors, and simple things like that. But then if you start looking at what Tesla is doing now, is they're putting all the stuff into the car, all the accessories into the car, and then you activate it later on and you pay your subscription, or you can pay extra. And you see BMW doing this. Now, if you start creating edge services, that everything, all the compute is on the edge, it gets faster, it gets quicker, the cost should be more efficient. The problem right now is the cost of entry to 5G is so high and the cost of the chipset is so high, but the radio access network isn't supporting it just yet. So our first launch with 5G will be in APAC in January and February. We're really excited about that, but it'll be a small set of use cases on real high-end cars starting out, and then it'll go to the masses. So it's the same thing as that we were talking earlier. It's all about the evolution. Okay, so it's about, we want to get to the moon, but where do we start first?
Right.
Yeah, agree. And then I wanted to also chat about a burning question that probably is on everyone's mind. What has changed in the last 6 months? I mean, car sales they're one of the lowest they've ever been. Consumers are they're not going to work as much anymore. Everyone's working from home, or maybe something else is going on. And wanted to hear your perspective. How has COVID changed the IoT environment, and what's the impact? Like, what will be the short term and the long term, do you think, on the industry?
So, Greg, I'll take it from what we see from live data, and you can take it from an investment purpose or view. For us, what we saw is we were connecting probably in 2016. Our big entry to market was 2016. We were doing 120,000 cars that year. Before pre-COVID, we were then deploying that every month, every 5 weeks. We were deploying 150,000 cars into the market, 180,000 cars. So we were on a trajectory that just stopped and slowed down because production facilities slows down. And we were on track to be doing about 320,000 cars a month. So that's what we saw in a production. So how our business was scaling, that slowed down. Separate to that, what we saw is when lockdown happened, in real time, we could see how vehicles stopped moving. So we used to see that the average life cycle of a vehicle or a day cycle of a vehicle was 11 hours. That changed completely. And we saw that people were using the car a lot less, going on shorter journeys, i.e. to the shop and return, or to see a friend, or to see the office and come back. But they weren't going on long journeys, business trips, holidays, all of that stopped. And we saw probably about a 75% drop on the network of traffic while all these countries were in lockdown. And as the countries started to ease lockdown, you could see the numbers picking back up again. So this was real insights that we got in real time, and we were able to feed this back to the OEM that could understand how their manufacturing process was working as well, and which markets were kicking in and which weren't. This is information that they never had before. Obviously had a dramatic effect on us with the downturn, but then you were able to see it in real time, which was key as well.
Yeah, I would add, I guess on a macro level, if you think about the industry, the sector between passenger cars and commercial vehicles, more so on the passenger car side, mobility as a service was, a secular change that was really starting to take hold, and that's where you've seen quite a bit of investment. A high percentage of the investment in transportation has gone into mobility as a service. So a lot of the conversation prior to the pandemic was that we were nearing kind of the peak automotive age in terms of units produced and units sold. We were nearing 100 million units globally. China is still the number one market both for production and consumption, and that was really going to plateau. The growth was going to kind of evaporate. And if you think about mobility as a service, we'll take China again as an example. There was a McKinsey study that talked. It was just last year. It talked about their prediction is that 66% of miles driven by 2040 will be done by autonomous vehicles, and that mobility will be a $1.1 trillion business in China alone. So the investment was continuing to flow into how do we make this happen? How do we make it commercially viable? Because you can't just make a product and think, great, we've made it, we've done it, we're there. Everyone's going to be happy that we did it. You have to make sure it's a profitable venture and endeavor. Just use an endeavor plug. But I think the investment has slowed, but it can't stop, because I think a lot of CEOs and corporates in the sector and space understand that at some point we'll get past this pandemic, and the world is going to continue to change, and that this is the future. So you cannot slow down. It has been a race. They're figuring out new ways to run the race. It's no longer a quote unquote one person race. It's multiple teams that are trying to get to a certain endpoint, but it's not going to stop.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. And what are kind of I wanted to chat about also the failures in the industry, and like what are technologies or business models or specific examples where things haven't worked in your experience, and what are common pitfalls that entrepreneurs can avoid?
So I think one thing we were talking about was the massive investments they made into ride sharing and ride sharing solutions. GM into Maven is a prime example, 500 million that went in. So there's different things that you thought were really good back to you would have said yes, it was scaling, and then you have a pandemic came that no one thought, and it's changed completely. So for us, I think when we looked at Cubic, we were looking at how we were making it better access to the customer, real-time information, real-time insights. And we stayed true to that and said, okay, how can we start pushing more software in to the client? And really, we started looking, how can we address their needs so we can alarm and alert on a new product in the marketplace in real time? We can cut their cost of testing. So we went and looked at what they were making investment in, and how could we save them either R&D dollars or euros, or how could we get them into a market quicker, or how could we give them insights of what's happening? So for us, as an entrepreneur leading that business, revenue came down, production started stopping, and we started looking, okay, the real live data that we have, how can we start using that to drive back into the OEM to show that we're creating value in a constant chain? So for us, connectivity is key because it enables everything into the vehicle. But people think connectivity is a given. Everyone thinks their Wi-Fi is just here, but it's massively complex. Okay, and then you've got different radio access networks, different cores, different technologies, and different components in that core. And to transit that all the way through and give real-time insights, we were able to show each component of the core, each component of the radio access network, each component of the vehicle that was going down. So we've really started making those real-time alert and monitoring a key part of the Cubic portfolio. So it got us to think really, really quickly. And that's what I think has changed for us over the last 6 months.
Mm-hmm. No, that's a great point. Also wanted to chat about autonomy and autonomous cars, and it's a very, very dear topic to me. In the meantime, want to encourage all our participants to send any questions. So if you could post questions to the chat, and then I'll make sure to address them as we go. We do have another 15 minutes left on the panel. So feel free to post anything, and in the meantime, we'll continue talking about IoT and autonomy. So my next question is more around kind of the full stack autonomy, level 4, level 5, and which is something we've been thinking is is the holy grail, and we're all waiting to go to the street, get into an autonomous car, and get to our destination without ever having to look on the road and to even ever learn how to drive. of course, at extreme levels of safety. The question is that today that's not, the case. There's no proliferation of autonomous cars in our cities. And my question is, why is that? Why were the timelines pushed out? Why have a lot of OEMs went back to kind of promoting their level 2, level 3 systems? And when can we could see full autonomy?
I guess I'll start that one. Yeah, I think we all thought by this year, 2020, that you'd start to see more and more autonomous vehicles. I think there's a prediction that I read once a few years ago that said there'd be 10 million autonomous vehicles on the road by this year. So that obviously didn't happen. I think it really boils down to the complexity. We have the product, it's worked. There's millions of miles traveled by Google Waymo's autonomous fleet very safely, but more so on open roads. You still have to put the infrastructure in the more densely populated cities. And I think to do that, you have to have governments that, it goes back to Barry's point, people have to agree on kind of how it's going to be regulated, mandated, legislated, and how to roll it out safely. There's insurance applications here, or insurance implications, not applications, implications. So there are a lot of factors that, you still need to consider and work through before you can have large scale adoption of autonomous vehicles. And then it goes back to cost again, and it's still expensive, right? The fact that when LiDAR came out, one LiDAR unit was $70,000, and now that's dropped considerably over the years. A full kind of autonomous vehicle package is still fairly expensive. I mean, how many people out there today are even taking the level 3 ADAS safety package when they're looking at different cars? It's going to happen. It will happen over time. It always happens with technology. When it first comes out, it's very expensive because of the amount of dollars that have come into it, the amount of time that's spent, the evolution. It will get there as it becomes more commercialized and easier to manufacture, and costs come down, and we get smarter about it. But it just hasn't happened as fast as we thought it. And I don't know, Barry, if you have any other thoughts on it.
I think it's massively political. We saw with V2X, is it going to be a Wi-Fi network, a cellular network? Who was behind that? Who was lobbying at it? So we saw a massive change that way. We also see it's really, I think, down to law and regulation. The political part of it is there. If no one's agreeing to that one standard, and we talked about that earlier on in the conversation. So there's not a framework agreement that's there to say these are the standards as an OEM we're going to follow. And this is where I see the opportunity, or back to the earlier questions, the opportunity for companies like Cubic is that that horizontal part again that's there. But if you can break out and start enabling that vertical component to plug in, that's where the opportunity is. Like we all know sitting around here today that the software is there and we can get into a car and we can use it. The problem is the laws and regulations and where you want to use that car is that's the prohibitive factor. So it's not the technology, it's not the software, it's the laws and regulations and the politics behind that. And that's because there's no standard or framework agreement that all the OEMs have agreed to follow and set the standard and push those standards through. And we saw that with V2X, because they wouldn't even get a community there to say, okay, that's what we're agreeing to. So I think the politics is a massive thing to play in not just this business, it's in every business that we operate ourselves in, but that's also where the opportunity is. If we can make this an efficient way of doing it, and as you said, Greg, cost prohibitive and get the cost down, that's where you start seeing the OEMs move across. So from LiDAR at $70,000, if you look at like a connected car, that's about $600 over the life of the vehicle just to put basic connectivity into it. So how can we then say that it's not cost prohibitive to do this? I think that's what the challenge is, but that's also what the opportunity is.
Yeah, and I do think the opportunity near term is more on the commercial side in terms of long haul trucking and being able to autonomize, put autonomous trucks, Class 8 trucks, which is kind of a scary thought. You think these big rigs that are massive and very heavy, carrying a lot of freight, but they have very predetermined routes. There's already an infrastructure in place for hubs where trucks can go to, and then a trucker can get in the cab and drive it last mile. You're not kind of bound by the 11-hour driving limits here in the United States or whatever other regulations are around the world, and just human involvement. You take a truck, you fill it, and you send it on its way. I think that has much more commercial opportunity in the near future than your more consumer vehicles.
I think if you look at Emmett's question there, based on the
Yeah, I
timings
was
of
just
using,
going to address it.
yeah, because if you look at using like a fleet in a truck, you could use that at off-peak hours from midnight to 6 a.m. when the roads are free, and then using autonomous vehicles in that instance, it has to be trucking, it has to be shipping. That's where you're going to see the biggest impact so quick, and that's where you're going to see cost efficiencies and climate efficiencies as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and on so we do have, so the question, just to make sure we all hear Emmett's question. The question is, with the explosion of vehicle miles and autonomy, what do you see as the most impactful innovations that can reduce traffic congestion? And wanted to also talk, and Barry mentioned trucking. Another thing is in the V2X, so the vehicle talking to the infrastructure. So as traffic lights see the traffic that's going through a specific intersection, or if there's a public bus, they're able to pass through that bus quicker. They can adjust, based on traffic patterns, different times of the day. The traffic lights will have different signal times. And then another thing is basically as vehicles, instead of going fast and slow and always going brakes and fast, the autonomous vehicles can actually go at the same speed, and then they can you reduce traffic significantly. So you get rid of the kind of the tailwind of traffic that just keeps aggregating. So that's, yeah, hopefully we'll see a lot less traffic. TBD what will happen in cities. I've also heard a lot of secondary effects, for example, where let's say we all can take robotaxis, and in a city, like you're going to start, instead of the cars using parking space, right now the cars can just drive around autonomously. So I've heard theories that say that the cities would just get congested of cars looping around waiting for their next customer.
Right. Ride hailing as well. The number of cars sitting there out looking for new fares. That
Yep.
added to congestion. It hasn't reduced it. So it's a great question. What types of innovations? I think, as cities become smarter, as they become more equipped and higher tech, you'll see things and new ideas, and there'll be new companies that come out with probably new products and services that help address that issue. But I don't think there's any one thing I can point to that say it's a silver bullet that's going to fix congestion issues.
Mm-hmm. And of course, platooning as Barry mentioned, for trucking. Like if you have platooning in logistics, you actually can reduce the fuel consumption by as much as, I believe, 20% of the tail truck, which gets less of the wind from the road. But so there's a lot of opportunities.
Is this a bit like the race to space, though? Because if you look at it, because there's no common language out there, there's no common framework, everyone is spending huge amounts of money trying to do the same thing. Okay, so if you think about it, everybody is spending money. They're going in different directions. It's kind of like shooting fish in a pond with a machine gun. They're just out there. If the companies came together and created a common framework, then there's certain parts that could come in, and then you could know where to innovate correctly to reduce the cost. But the issue that you have right now, especially with V2X or especially with autonomous driving, is each one of the OEMs wants to be the first. Okay, and they're spending huge amounts of money on doing that, but they're each doing it in a different way. So then if you then come in and you sit in front of the politicians, or you sit in front of the local municipalities and you say, this is how we're doing it, the next OEM comes in and says they're doing it completely different. So they have to be educated in so many things. If they really tried to simplify the process and took a singular or a multiple or two-prong approach there, I think people would understand it easier, and then might get the governing law through a lot quicker as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. And also, I mean, it's true that there's been a lot of vertical integration. So every company trying to emulate what Waymo is doing, or Tesla trying to build their stack from the ground up, and then do everything from perception, obstacle avoidance, integrate all the different sensors into one system, where it's almost like a black box where no one wants to disclose what happens inside the brain of the car and how it deals with all these different safe edge cases and how it actually works. We do have another question from Fergal. How far advanced? How do you expect connectivity innovation in vehicles to realistically be in the next 5 year in a 5 years timeline? So vehicle connectivity. Barry, that's maybe you're best to answer that. Yeah.
So I think, first of all, if you look at connectivity over the last decade, I think Tesla led kind of software updates and different parts of that, but now it's gone into the masses. So other companies are all trying to do that. You've got companies the likes of Redbend who are doing safe OTAs over the air. That's now being acquired. I think connectivity, first of all, is a must and it's a given. I think because connectivity was between $20 and $50 a gigabyte back then, that's come right down now, and the cost is and the consumption. So cost has come down, consumption's going up. So what I think connectivity is going to do is really enhance the user experience. I think that's what it's going to do. It's really going to customize it. So the way that the new iOS 14 came out now and you can change your home screen, you're going to be able to set up the car the way you want to. And then when you get into your wife's car or your husband's car, your partner's car, that screen will change the way you like it and the settings will all be there. So it won't be done through the key, it'll be done through your persona. And I think that will travel with you. And I think connectivity will enable that. I also think connectivity will enable the types of features that should be in a vehicle and watch the R&D dollars. And then lastly, for us, what we see as a big thing is they're going to use that for testing new vehicles in the market, testing what the products are out there, but testing along the production line. So when the car is manufactured and the module is able to be powered up, it's testing all the functionality straight away. So instead of the car being delivered and the customer having a poor customer experience, that's changed along the whole logistical route or during the manufacturing route. So I think over the next 5 years, that's where you're going to see the user experience and the manufacturing process really change, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and to that note, I wanted to also add, especially for having AI at the edge, that's something that's been discussed a lot, and I believe we're finally in a place where we're starting to see that. So with, for example, new chips that now can enable not super complicated AI, but at least, for example, very simple kind of running a model that's kind of doing inference. So not the training of the model, but inference of the model at the edge. That's something that now we start to see more. Training usually is still done in data centers. It's very expensive and very data intensive to do training, but actually deploying a model in the car and not having to constantly communicate with the cloud is now possible with chips that cost less than $10 and just use a few watts of energy. Versus if you look at an autonomous car today, more like an R&D unit, where you do have an expensive sensor package of several tens of thousands of dollars. Like those cars actually have several NVIDIA GPUs. They're very, very expensive, and it's not something you can have in a traditional consumer car. So we're also seeing a lot of innovation on the silicon, having very cheap at scale AI capable devices on the edge.
So we work with Qualcomm, and Qualcomm's an investor in the company, and the general manager of their automotive division, Nakul, sits on our board. And the ideas and the discussions that we're having about how we can design the chip securely connected to the cloud, how we can enable that globally, and how we can maximize the functionality, they're the types of discussions that we're having. And then going to the OEM and saying that over the life of the vehicle, you can change the custom setup of the chipset. This is something that has never been done before. And I think this is something that could be key.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think the conversations are happening and have been happening. I mean, most companies that deal with kind of the interior architecture of automobiles, and again, it's an evolution. When you go back to 15 years ago, it was all about just the materials in the car, the comfort of the ride, et cetera. Now it's all about the infotainment, the connectivity, telematics, your instrument clusters, all being part of one kind of CPU-driven system. And then how do you then customize? It goes back to what your comment was earlier, Barry. How do you customize that for the consumer? It's learning about consumer preferences, and you'll see that there are different types of instrument panels that are coming out, whether it's 3D, et cetera, and they'll have varying degrees of capabilities and apps on them. And it is really being driven by connectivity. So I think there's a tremendous amount of investment. There's a tremendous amount of focus and effort that's going into connectivity, and I do to continue to evolve in the next 5 years significantly.
And one thing we didn't touch on is the weight factor. So if you think about it, how much weight was in the car with all the wiring and the looms that were put in there before? Now you have compute power in there. So you can put something really, really small. Look at how much compute has grown in 10 years. You put that into a vehicle now, you reduce all the wiring looms and the weight, and you're making it more efficient again. So there's things that we haven't even touched on we could go on all night about, or all morning in your area.
We could. We'd have to get a drink though. We talked about that.
Yeah, and also wanted to chat about kind of more ways to autonomy. So we talked a lot about the consumer, but there's also a lot of founders probably who are doing B2B startups or who are thinking about commercial vehicles or different ways to address the market. So I wanted to chat about bounded autonomy. So like if instead of use autonomy or IoT as well in consumer cars or robo taxis, what are some applications you've seen or that you think could emerge that are beyond consumer cars that could be also leveraging the technologies and the innovation we currently have?
Yeah, I think robotaxis that was one of the first in big investment thesis about how we can reduce the cost of transportation. It was an augmentation of kind of public transportation, but at your fingertips, right? Being able to get anywhere at any time by a push of a button. I think that how commercially sensible and actually making turn on your investment, that's been a little bit more difficult and challenging for folks to figure out. But I do think maybe shuttles and other ways of getting people to move around densely populated urban cities you'll see more of a focus, I think, on that versus wide scale, large fleets of robotaxis out to the public. So I don't know if you had any thoughts on it yourself.
I think, again, going back, not to sound repetitive, that vertical versus horizontal, now that OEMs are really enabling software, it's giving the startups and B2B different types of use cases an easier way of getting into the marketplace. Okay, so they can do something more on a local level rather than trying to go global. Okay, so if they break into a local market, they can go through APIs, they can show a use case, they can do it really quick, really fast impact, and then they can scale that. So I think you're going to see those types of solutions. So you're going to see OEMs creating a service platform locally, and they're going to have local services integrated into their device platform and into their backend. So you're going to see those components that were in a horizontal stack that was locked, that they wanted to own end to end. You're going to see that flip over now, and different components are going to be open where different types of business models can be plugged in depending on the locale. And then for the likes of robo taxis or anything like that, it's going to really start pushing local services, advertisements, any type of things that you want on a local level, where global just doesn't work and doesn't give a return on the investment.
Yeah, and to that point,
it's a good point.
I can also provide kind of my view from the investing world. Having invested in two LiDAR companies, one is now doing a SPAC, so it's on the public markets called Luminar. Another one is also high resolution long distance LiDAR. But wanted to chat about mention there's as we discussed earlier, like in L4, L5 has been very challenging, and it will be years until we see robo taxis in our cities, until we can go to see our friends on the other side of town with a robo taxi. But we do see, and in the deals that I see on a daily basis, I do see a lot of something called, or I refer to as bounded autonomy. So for example, constrained problems. So instead of trying to use the cities or city streets for autonomy, maybe you have shuttles that just operate in campuses. So you have less variability, and you have an environment that is easier to tackle, and you have less edge cases, or maybe the edge cases are not as dangerous because your speed is only a few miles an hour, and so that's definitely seen. You see basically the same innovations in simulation, in data aggregation and connectivity, using cloud, using AI at the edge, using next gen sensors, very high performance sensors, but actually using those technologies for things like autonomous excavators. We've invested in a company called Build Robotics that's automating like these massive machines, for example, that John Deere makes that weigh several tons, and they put an autonomy stack using IoT, using sensors. They leverage all the data, and then the machine becomes completely autonomous, but it only operates within that environment, which is usually already predefined. Like it only can go within that part of the construction site. We've also invested in another commercial cleaning company. Again, called AvidBots. They took the sensor suite that usually cars would use, but deployed it on a robot that would normally have a human driving it around, going, the same kind of simple back and forth repetitive work that humans do, but now it's fully automated. So I've seen just a lot of that innovation spilling over to other industries, and that's been really interesting. And those are companies that even today they have revenue and customers, and they are able to deploy the solutions when L4, L5 just has been so much difficult and the timelines are still unknown. Yep. We do have a few more. We can take a few more questions if the audience has any more questions for to put in the chat. Also wanted to chat about just generally. We mentioned regulations and kind of the general changes across geographies, and wanted to hear both of your perspectives. Like, is there an area now that you see as the next hotspot for IoT and autonomy? Is it what's special about specific geographic areas? And you guys have both, perspectives from the US and Europe, and I have the Silicon Valley perspective from a different coast. But where do you think will be the next kind of hotspot of innovation for IoT?
So from my perspective, I'd say LATAM. Asia is a tough market with the laws and regulations. We see that with the EU-ICC swapping the SIM from one profile to another. Apple aren't allowed to do it with their watch. We did this back in 2017 with the GSMA, and we haven't been able to get approval just yet. So we started focusing our efforts in LATAM. We see Brazil as a key market. It's 7th largest car market in the world. Okay, so we see we can get a good return on our investment. So for us, what we looked at is working with the local operators, the local regulatory bodies down there to see how we could do that. So that's been challenging. That's taken us over 24 months, and we got our license only probably about 60 days ago. So that was a big challenge, but that's a big opportunity for us. And again, it's not just for the automotive. We have CASE, which is CASE New Holland. So it's agricultural, it's IoT. And we think that that's a huge opportunity for us. And Brazil is a big agricultural market. So we looked at that for autonomy, for automotive, and we saw it for agricultural IoT. So there were two key markets for us, and obviously the rest of LATAM. I don't know about you, Greg, what your view is.
No, I think you kind of nailed the geographies. I would just take it in a different direction in the thought of kind of what is it regulatory wise, who owns the data. I think is going to be a significant and really hard fought discussion and debate. And how readily available can you make that data and to whom? I mean, that's really, I think, the crux of how this is going to roll out, because I think there are going to be varying opinions region by region. And you get back to it, I don't think it's going to be a common answer. I think it's going to be very specific to countries and continents. So I don't know if you feel differently, Barry, but that seems to be a very hot topic.
Yeah, and do you think with China kind of emerging as such a with the more or less the trade war and like AI, machine learning, kind of developing almost as separate ecosystems, like China, it's very unlikely that we'll see, for example, Chinese autonomous cars on US roads. Kind of, do you see these two ecosystems developing separate, and where does Europe fit in that?
My perspective on that is the Chinese auto manufacturers see that they need a Chinese solution for their home market, and they need a separate solution exactly the same way. If you look at the likes of GM and Ford started, they went with a local operator to get connectivity, and then went with different operator partners outside. Now they see that that's cost prohibitive and doesn't scale correctly. So the mindset's really changed. I think politics with China and outside of China is a big thing right now. So that is a challenge, and especially that China sees the US as a big target market, especially for the auto industry. So they're going to have a massive challenge, especially with Trump in the House at the moment, because he's blocking all of that. So I think that's where the challenge is going to be. So again, the software is there, the technology is there, the politics steps in. So for us, instead of us chasing after a market that's political, that we won't have an influence on, we looked at where was a market that we could, and we looked at obviously the likes of LATAM is key for us. Russia is another key market for us. But then you have the laws and regulations that come in. So that's a time factor, going, educating, making sure that the local regulator is comfortable with you, you're partnering with the local operator. So I think if anyone can get into China, it's a success story. It really is, because that is one of those countries that just scale is just like no one ever believes. Okay, and it's quick and it's fast.
Yeah.
And thanks, Barry. That's a great perspective. Wanted to kind of wrap the panel. I know we're out of time, but wanted kind of to ask both of you to give any last pieces of advice for entrepreneurs, and what would you advise them on a takeaway, kind of how to succeed in the IoT and automotive world? Like what are one or two key pieces of advice they should take home?
So for me, the one thing is when we met with automotives that said it couldn't be done, we didn't believe them. We proved to them that it could be done with software. So we had to change the mindset of saying, stop focusing on hardware, look at software, and that's a key factor. So I think there's some amazing software companies coming up behind Cubic, okay? And then obviously with this horizontal market going more vertical, that's where the real opportunity is. So I think that's something that's class. And I think for any entrepreneur that's in that, don't give up. Okay, it's easy to say no, it's easy to walk away. Money is extremely hard. Our first million was the hardest million that we ever raised, and then we've raised probably just shy of $150 million since then, and our last was about $46 million. Okay, and we've raised that on all in ordinary shares. So there is some really good money out there. There's some really good investors out there, and I think that's a great opportunity. But if you really have good belief and you've got a great team, for me, I have an excellent team around me. So I think that's the steps to really focus on. So team, and don't say no.
Thanks, Barry.
Yeah, continue to network and tell your story. If you look at the amount of venture capital funds and firms that are now focused on this space, there are quite a few people out there that'll listen. So, understand your story, how it can be commercially viable, how it can scale up. There are a lot of great, smart people out there with fantastic ideas, and you just got to believe in your story and be able to articulate it and how it makes sense and how it's going to be viable
Makes
for
sense.
large scale production.
This was awesome. Your insights were super valuable and amazing to hear all your great experience and all the stories and facts you added. I hope our panelists enjoyed it as well. And with this, I would like to wrap up our session today.
Thanks for sharing, Linda. Greg, great seeing you.
Thank you.